Yesterday, I was thinking about writing manuals, and I glanced at my shelf and I noticed Mary Oliver's book, A Poetry Handbook. Now, I read this in grad school, but looking at it, I couldn't remember more than a line or two of it. So I thought, well, I have vaguely warm feelings toward this, so I should just go ahead and reread it. I got about a third of the way through, and then I remembered that I had been assigned this in graduate school, and I had spoken warmly about it in class, uh, but that I had been absolutely too lazy actually to read it. But by this point, I was already in too far, so I thought I don't really want to spend a whole more than a day on this. I have to power through, and I did. I read the rest of the book. It's not that long a book. I read the rest of the book, finished it last night, and I can report that it's fucking ridiculous. It's not a good book. I should not have felt warmly toward it. It's simultaneously dull, confusing, obvious, and wrong, while also promoting this ethos that feels likely to inspire generations of uh, billowy sleeved wooden bracelet wearing confident poetry murmurers. In her section on Whitman, for example, these two sentences appear consecutively. To study Whitman's poetry is to learn about Whitman's poetry. Period. Such is genius. Period. I'm baffled. For sheer juxtapositional paradoxical brevity. I mean, that rivals Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro. I mean, that's a Zen koan. In place of using the word boilerplate or cliched writing to talk about writing that's tired, that's been overused, she chooses the term poetic diction, which in a book about how to write poetry is really fucking confusing. In her section on imagery, she states, this is a quotation, figurative language is another term for imagery. Which I think the closest paraphrase of that I could think of would be metaphor is another term for thing. Oh God! And her section on meter, I about got an embolism. She like Margaret Engel, like plenty of other people, she compares learning to write poetry to learning to play a musical instrument. Not an unfair comparison. And then she just concludes flatly, you shouldn't try to teach people how to write in meter and rhyme. Young poets should not learn to write in meter and rhyme because it's too hard. It's too hard. Just forget it. Never mind. It's too hard. She refers to an unaccented syllable as a stress, which is just almost exactly perfectly wrong, almost the perfect opposite of what's correct. Similarly, she says a feminine ending blurs the end or blurs the effect of an end rhyme, which is the opposite of what it does. And then this is okay. All right. So she continually refers to rhyme schemes as rhyming patterns, which, descriptively speaking, isn't technically inaccurate, but it's a little bit like having the priest at your wedding refer to your marriage vows as your getting married promises. It just doesn't sit right with me. I did not like this book. I do not agree with this book. I would not recommend this book. And yet, she gets some things right. In her about the realities of workshops and the contrasting virtues of solitude. She's just about faultless. And her section on revision is, concise, sharp, thoughtful, and more or less spot on. Here's this little passage I marked I thought was quite nice from the end of that section on revision. She says, "It is good to remember how many sweet and fine poems there are in the world. I mean, it is a help to remember that out of writing and the rewriting, beauty is born. It is good also to remember that, now and again, it is simply best to throw a poem away. Some things are unfixable." I thought that was pretty nice. I liked that. And, I think more importantly than all of this, all right, I realize I'm not the target audience for this book. I am a grouchy, self-loathing, vaguely existentialist lapsed Catholic. And she's a cheerful, well-adjusted, Epicurean talking butterfly. And so, I thought about the writing guides that I do love, the grouchier writing guides, the more jaded writing guides, the stuffier writing guides. I love Strunk and White, The Elements of Style. I love Hollander's Rhymes Reason. I love Gardner's The Art of Fiction. He's a fucking grouch if there ever was one. I love Horace's Ars Poetica, The Poetics, even Stephen King's On Writing, and all of those are full of wrongness. I mean, they're all flawed. They all get things off. They all are short-sighted, or they're biased. They're self-serving. They're all of them messy and flawed, and all of them, like Mary Oliver's, show a thoughtful, caring mind at work in a craft and in a tradition, pulling up the different pieces of it, examining them, and putting pressure on them in order to identify what works where and how. Even where she's most wrong, say intersection on meter, she still identifies accurately enough of the basics that if you step back, you can more or less tell where she's wrong. That it's obvious that there is an opinion and a human limited mind operating in addition to a less limited, less subjective tradition, which is true again for all of these books. It's just that I do think some are better than hers. I don't think she rivals Aristotle, but I also think that, okay, so in the Odyssey, we take this word mentor from the Odyssey, from this moment when Athena, who is devoted to Odysseus, she slips down onto the mortal plane, and she disguises herself as an old man named Mentor in order to nudge Odysseus' son Telemachus further along in his adventure, to advance his father's ultimate happy homecoming. Now, in contrast to the way we use the word mentor today, the mentor in the Odyssey is hardly a constant, encouraging, a dependable source of advice and wisdom for Telemachus. The mentor in the Odyssey is the sort of a sudden, slightly disorienting, provocative intervention, rooted totally in lies and deception, with his own agenda or her own agenda. this is just a powerful colliding presence for collision with which Telemachus is ultimately richer. And that's about like the experience of reading The Art of Fiction. If I'm honest, I'm as moved by having gotten to witness John Gardner's arm wrestling with himself over 200 pages as I am uh, uh, any better informed writer for having heard his often sort of cockeyed observations about technique. Um, so, in conclusion, if you are a healthy, nature loving, kind, generous soul who doesn't care that much about prosody, but who likes poetry, and more importantly, who likes the person that you see in the morning when you look in the mirror, then you really ought to read Mary Oliver's A Poetry Handbook. She's honestly, genuinely wonderful, and so are you. But, frankly, if that's the kind of person you are, then you're not listening to this fucking show. A couple of years ago, there was that book, Dreyer's English by the Random House copy chief. It was a writing style guide, pretty good. The subtitle was it was Dreyer's English, an utterly correct guide to clarity and style, and I thought it was pretty smart, pretty reasonable throughout. Obviously the subtitle is a little bit tongue in cheek, the utterly correct part, but if there's one thing that kept it from standing out of the crowd of popular style guides, it was a lack of any interesting wrongness. Oh God, and I forgot I didn't even mention Arthur Quiller Couch's lectures on the art of writing, which is so fucking good. Just the last lecture alone, I might have to devote an episode to. But I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. Today, I thought I would. I've gotten a fair amount of emails and notes in through different media, and I thought I would answer some questions and respond to some comments, because I've gotten some really lovely notes and some really lovely notes that had some complaints or requests. So I thought I would talk about some of those, and there's maybe a slightly longer one I'm going to get to at the end. But to start off, and most of these I'm going to leave unnamed, because I don't want to call attention to anybody who does not want it. So I got a very nice note through Erratosphere from a listener who asked for manna more, and I knew manna from the Bible, but I didn't realize it's, I guess, can be used as a synonym for more. In any case, thank you. That was very nice. Another listener also said some very nice things, and then added that I could be very long-winded. He said, and also that the show didn't have enough poems in it. Thank you to that as well. I cannot promise to become any less long-winded over time, but I can promise to add some more poems. And I will try to start with that this week. So this this next listener, I'm laughing. I'm very very grateful for all of this. I'm laughing only because this was an especially prolific response responder. She had a lot of notes. I'm going to call her E, which is not her name or initial, but it will be helpful because there were multiple notes from the same person, or sorry, there was multiple criticisms from the same person, all of which I thought were worth a moment's consideration at least. So she said that the logo was very nice. She complimented the logo, the little red square with the skeleton and the word SLEERICKETS in it. She said it was a good logo, but it was misleading. And here's the quote from her note. I think the graphic perhaps sets up an expectation that isn't quite delivered, a kind of goth rock spliff visual communication, as although I think the content I listened to is erudite, well argued, well presented, and interesting, thank you, apart from the odd expletive, it doesn't really echo the goth rock spliff vibe. I can't argue. The one quibble I do have is with the word spliff, which is, I believe, British for joint. To my knowledge, that skeleton is smoking a standard issue tobacco cigarette, or maybe a hand-rolled cigarette. So that is actually a study my brother did of Van Gogh's painting Head of a Skeleton with a Burning Cigarette. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. If there is a divergence between the mood or the tone of the logo and that of the show, it is simply the difference. It represents the difference between how cool my brother is and how cool I am or am not. So I asked him for some sort of memento mori because I thought that would be fitting, and this is what he came up with, which I quite like. Though I like a square small town dad with a motorcycle club tattoo. I will probably never live up to its promise, but I plan to stick with it. A quick note, because the font which we negotiated between us is a black letter font. He did his line in the sand was he said sans serif fonts are for cowards. My brother's a designer and artist. He works for the Eckelman studio, and he's a photographer and artist in his own right, but he has strong opinions about sans serif fonts. He thinks that sans serif fonts are for those who've been brain poisoned by the Steve Jobsification of 20th century American industrial design. So I'll include in the show notes a link to his website. He's a very good artist. Do brace yourself for a lot of nudity. All right, so back to E. My very thoughtful listener. She also asked for timestamps for the different segments, so she could skip the ones that sounded less interesting. Totally fair request. I'm learning the technology as I go, and I will get to that at some point, I'm sure. And then her final criticism, and I think maybe the most the one that warrants the most thoughtful response on my part, was that she said I only present one perspective, which is fair enough given that it's a podcast, but she sort of wished, given the length of the show, that there was room for more critical conversation. The simple answer is I am planning some really good interviews with some different writers, different people. And so there will be some more literal voices in the room very soon. I'm going to come back to that criticism later because it was echoed by another, friend. Brian wrote to let me know that despite my claim in, I think it was episode 3, you can teach dessert in school. I think it was Adam Kirsch's observation that poetry is dessert, but it gets taught as if it's vegetables. I think Brian's right. You can teach poetry as if it is dessert. You can't. I do. When I used to teach, my goal was always to make the material I brought in, to choose the material, for its appealing qualities, among others, and to try to make it as appealing, to present it in as appealing a fashion as possible. The downfall maybe of that strategy, and I think what I meant with my remark that you can't teach dessert in school, is that it may be one of those situations where, by definition, once you bring it into school and teach it, it stops being dessert. Sort of like how, no matter how hard the thrash metal, once your parents are listening to it, you can no longer mosh to it. That was what I had in mind. Angela wrote to say again, despite my claim in episode 4, that podcasting and ASMR and maybe even porn can indeed be art under the right circumstances, and I think she is right, again, with a caveat, and that caveat, I guess, is the insofar as ASMR, podcasting, porn is defined by a medium, right? It is defined by its sort of the properties that it has, how it reaches our ears or minds, eyes, etc. Any medium can be put to the use of making art. So definitely, yeah, of course. Insofar as it is defined by its function, maybe less so. Cameron wrote in with some very nice things to say, a lot of enthusiasm and some interesting observations about the poetry world, and also noted Cameron is just 17 years old, which is fucking terrifying, but also heartwarming. So welcome again, Cameron. And I just hope that this very dumb podcast does not scare you away from poetry. Shane McCrae wrote, and he's a wonderful poet editor, well, I don't know. I think he's a reviewer as well, but definitely prolific poet and editor of Image. He wrote in, among other things, to recommend a poem that I'd never read, and I thought it's very short, so I thought I would just read it now because it's just really fucking good. So this is Days by Janet Loxley Lewis. Days. Swift and subtle, the flying shuttle crosses the web and fills the loom, leaving for range of choice or change no room. No room. That's it. 7 lines. 7 lines, this is 7 lines of Demeter, incredibly tightly constructed. This is AAXBCCB. That is a really fucking hard kind of poem to write, let alone while constructing an utterly lucid and insightful and moving sentence, as she does. Maybe the little element that I find most interesting in it is that third line, which is the only unrhymed line. Now, I was trying to look this up, and I need to dig up one of my fucking glossaries. Maybe M.H. Abrams has this somewhere. But my memory is that when you have in a stanza, when you have a stanza with a regular rhyme scheme, and that stanza includes a single unrhymed line. I think there's I want to say that Frost poem that got found about the Blue Jays. I think that poem has one of these. I think that's a 5-line stanza with an unrhymed line. But my recollection is that the unrhymed line in the stanza is referred to as a thorn, which I may or may not be. I'm pretty sure that's true, but I could not find. It's actually hard to. My Googling skills are not up to the task. But so I don't know if you would call it a thorn when it's only the one little stanza. But it's a wonderful word for that. And in this case, I think it's a moment that calls attention to itself by not matching anything else in the poem. And as it happens, the word that lack of, the one end word that does not rhyme is web, which is also I think that image, the spider's web, I think doesn't appear anywhere else in the poem. But of course, we're talking about a loom here, and so we can't help but think of Arachne, who foolishly challenged Athena to a contest and was for her trouble was transformed into a spider. So there's I think a wonderful kind of parallel threat here where we feel at once caught in the web of the days that don't give us any room. We can't escape these days in which we live, but also that we are ourselves constructing this web in which we're caught. And as like Arachne, maybe it's both our work sort of traps us here, and we are the thing that is, we are both the spider and the prey. I'll read it once more. I mean, it's just a marvelous little tiny thing. This is Gardner, I mentioned earlier. I think one of his more salient observations in that book, which is about fiction, but he said it's a shame that there are a lot of really good books that we don't teach in class because the goodness of them is so self-evident that there's nothing left over for the teacher to point out, and so teaching them doesn't make the teacher look smart. So we leave them out of school, and it's a real shame. I think this poem is sort of one of those. It doesn't need much commentary. It is so brilliantly, self-evidently, everything that it aims for. I'm going to read it one more time. Days by Janet Loxley Lewis. Swift and subtle, the flying shuttle crosses the web and fills the loom, leaving for range of choice or change no room. No room. I don't think it's intended in this poem, but that no room, I being as I am in the habit of reading a lot of children's stories right now, I of course I think of Alice in Wonderland, No Room at the Tea Party, and that, of course, that along with the thorn reminds me of one of the more brilliant uses of the thorn, so to speak, being A. Stallings' poem, Alice in the Looking Glass. That's one I might want to actually read and talk a little bit more about another time. But yeah, fucking thank you. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Janet Loxley Lewis. All right. Oh, and I've learned just this morning, Shane also just posted on Erratosphere for the first time. So if you're on there, make him feel welcome. He is terrific, and so is Erratosphere. Okay, so I wanted also to get to. I had a slightly longer conversation about the podcast with Jonathan Farmer, who's again as with Shane and several of these listeners, is a poet. He's also a reviewer and the editor of At Length. But he was critical of the way I talked about the poems that I read at the end of the episode, and at least I think you'd only listen to the first two or three at that point. But as he noted, I took a moment in each case. I think maybe not in the case of the Fenton Johnson poem, maybe just because it's so hard to recover from that one. But for the most part, I often will take a moment to examine a possible weakness, or maybe a soft spot, or an arguable compromise that is apparent in the poem, and he thought that I gave too much time to that, and then he thought, if I'm going to bother to bring up a poem that I think is worthwhile and read it for people, expose people to it, then I shouldn't give so much time to an examination of the poem's flaws, which I think was a totally fair criticism. I did, though, have something, I guess, I did have something in mind there. And this is why I mentioned E's comment earlier about bringing in multiple perspectives. I think the line that immediately came to mind when I read her note, and that came back to me in listening to Jonathan's criticism, was this line from Kierkegaard. I think it's in the Concept of Anxiety. He says, every good sermon is really a dialogue, or something like that. That's not a direct quote, but that's basically what he says. Every good sermon is really a dialogue. I don't know for sure what he meant, but I do know that line immediately made sense to me, because I think my first exposure to criticism was going to Mass every Sunday as a kid and listening to the sermons. Because a sermon is not a simple speech, at least in the Catholic tradition. You have a deacon often, or priest will read from the gospel, and there's a prescribed reading for each Sunday of the year, and then there's actually a 3-year lectionary cycle, so which you go through the 3 synoptic gospels. So the deacon and priest will read from the gospel, and then give a sermon or a homily illuminating the reading from the gospel. What this meant in practice, my memory growing up, was that the usually Irish priest would tell a story from his own life or from some other context, and it would be a sort of a story that didn't necessarily perfectly recapitulate the action of the reading from the gospel, but that in some way reframed the gospel reading in light of modern life. So the homily was an interpretation, but it was also a sort of it was not just a gloss, it was a response. It was a volley back. And then, of course, instead of praying like I was supposed to afterwards, kneeling in the pew, I would chew over what I thought of this story, whether it was a good story, whether I could make sense of it, what I thought of, if it helped clarify the gospel reading at all, which often it didn't. And then, of course, on the car ride home, my dad would give his opinion and would ask us what we thought, and we would argue. And then often, because I went to I lived in this tiny little, felt like a tiny Catholic cloister for the first 14 years of my life. The school I went to was actually directly attached to the church. It was all one complex. So I would go to school on Monday, and often the teacher would have been at the same service and heard the same sermon, and then she would have her own remark on it. And then, as I said, the liturgical calendar turns over every year, and then the lectionary cycle turns over every 3 years. So, going there for school and Mass year after year after year, I'd hear the same gospel reading come back around again, and with a different sermon, but often, the same priest. Sometimes a different priest, sometimes the same priest, but though he would be 3 years older, usually 3 years sort of sadder, and the response, the interpretation, the gloss, the reframing, all of this would be a little different. And it would be also colored, of course, by, my memory of the last go around. And if I had a conclusion that I could draw from this experience, this exposure to the concept of interpretation or of criticism, is that, every story or opinion that I encountered, even outside of this context, to me was implicitly stitched into a web made up of lots of other opinions and lots of other stories, and was tugged this way and that by its relationship to them and by its compromises, and it gained richness from these others, but it also was not it never stood alone, and also was never, the whole process was never settled. This was never a done deal, and that's actually not the same as saying everything's relative. It's not the same as saying everything's up for grabs. It was more like this kind of the same way, honestly, that a spider's web is never finished. It performs its function, but it's always being revised toward a goal, not toward no goal, not meaninglessly, but toward a goal that is never entirely complete. And I kind of assume, this may be again by my Irish ethnic propensity for bullshitting, but I sort of assume that when I speak, all of this goes without saying, that it's understood that this can't possibly be the last word on the subject. And speaking from my own personal experience publishing reviews and essays, which if there's anything that's a sort of a clear, specific take that I've nailed down, it would be a book review. And no sooner have I published one of those than I'm just ready to entirely abandon that claim, that argument. I want to rethink it again from the beginning. I hate the idea of holding a position. I'm much more interested in trying to continue the conversation. So, by the way, I have a pet theory that like a large portion of the philosophical debates across history are really can be kind of explained by a failure of each participant to account for what the other participants assumed went without saying. Rather than we say, oh, you why did you fail to mention this? Why did you fail to mention that? Of course, in many cases, I think the answer might be, well, I thought that was obvious. I didn't think I had to do that. Or in simpler terms, as my friend Ryan Wilson likes to say, that the same exact advice, especially for poets, good Lord, the same exact advice can be brilliant at one age and terrible at another. That puts me in mind of a little Robert Hayden poem, which it's a simple poem, and I think it's a little bit of a sleeper. It seems to be a simpler poem than it is. This is his poem, Paul Laurence Dunbar, obviously for the great poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. He dedicates it to Herbert Martin, who's another poet, though I believe closer to a contemporary of Hayden's. Still alive, I believe, Herbert Martin. So Robert Hayden writes this poem, Paul Laurence Dunbar, and it appears to be an elegy poem, but and it is an elegy, but it's not quite. It's not quite exactly what it appears to be. I'm going to read it quickly. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because I do want to keep moving us along. But, briefly, this is Robert Hayden's Paul Laurence Dunbar for Herbert Martin. We lay red roses on his grave, speak sorrowfully of him, as if he were but newly dead. And so it seems to us, this raw spring day. Though years before we two were born, he was a young poet dead. Poet of our youth, his cri de coeur our own, his verses in a broken tongue, beguiling as an elder brother's antic lore. Their sad black face lilt and croon survive him like the happy look, subliminal of victim, dying man, a summer's tintypes hold. The roses flutter in the wind. We weight their stems with stones, then drive away. So it, as I said, it appears to be a simple elegy. It's named after Paul Laurence Dunbar, and at the beginning is "We lay red roses on his grave." So you would think that it's a one poet offering an elegy for another, but that's not quite exactly what's happening here. As he says, it initially seems to be this seems to be a graveside service, but really, this is a poet who's been dead and was dead well before these two young poets were ever born. So they're not. It doesn't really make sense for them to be mourning him. He was always already dead as far as they're concerned. But there is a death that he's marking here. He calls him poet of our youth, his creed occur our own, his verses in a broken tongue, beguiling as an elder brother's antic lore. And right there, he puts in quotation marks, creed occur and in a broken tongue. And the suggestion there is that even as he's offering an appreciation for Dunbar's poetry, it's sort of couched within this context of youthful fancy or naivete or romanticism. That this is the sort of thing that an elder brother's antic lore is just the richest, most delightful, most engrossing thing in the world when you're a kid. But as you get older, it loses its power over you. He says their sad black face, lilt and croon survive him. And that refers to Dunbar famously wrote a number of poems in sort of a stylized Black American dialect. And that seems to be the way that Hayden is bracketing him, is setting him off and saying, well, those poems, that kind of poetry, the poetry of our youth, the poet, he was our hero, and he wrote these kinds of poems, and that was then. And that was something we loved, and we were moved and inspired by, but no longer. But of course, those poems, those dialect poems, only represent a small portion of Dunbar's poetry. I mean, he wrote a lot of poetry. He wrote prose. He wrote, he was a really prolific writer, and so it doesn't seem to be that Hayden is really mourning Dunbar, nor is he even, eulogizing Dunbar's poetry. He's really marking and setting off a part of his own poetic development. He's not even mourning, the Dunbar who was a poet, or he's mourning what Dunbar as a poet meant to him in his youth. That's why I think there's something really nice about the very last stanza there. The roses flutter in the wind. We weight their stems with stones, then drive away. On a simple level, of course, you want the roses, the flowers you bring to the grave. You want them to stay there. You don't want them to blow away. But if we imagine for a moment that Dunbar himself, Dunbar's reputation, Dunbar's poetry is not really adequately summarized or marked or celebrated by Hayden's characterization in the poem. The roses are fluttering as if they want to fly. He's trying to shake them off the grave, and Hayden and Martin need to weight them down. They say, no. This is what you meant. This is that we're saying goodbye to you. They have to weight them down with stones and then drive away because, almost in fear that the great old poet will come rearing back to life. It's a funny little poem. Again, not because I think it offers an absolute argument, but really just because it's less a proper elegy than it is a kind of a lyric for a particular experience of youth and the still youthful transition out of youth. Part of being young is kind of shedding your skin multiple times and every day, observing to the world, oh, what a fool I was yesterday, which of course takes at some point one realizes that never stops being the case. So when I talked to Jonathan, I mentioned an example that I hadn't really thought about consciously, but it was a little bit of a model for the critical comments I've offered of these poems at the end of the podcast. A model for it was So I used to listen to the New Yorker Poetry Podcast. It was never great. I have not listened much to the new one. So it used to be hosted by Paul Muldoon, who is the former poetry editor. It's now hosted by Kevin Young, who's the current poetry editor. Both of those poets, I think, interestingly, fabulously talented. Just on a the level of like innate verbal ability, just stunning. And both of them, I think, have fallen down a little bit in their later years, sort of for complementary reasons. In Muldoon's case, I think he has lost touch with the kind of the lightness and the sentiment of some of his early poems. He's begun to treat the language of each of his poems as so overly precious that they become stifling. And Kevin Young, I think, on the other hand, maybe has done a little bit the opposite. Has treated his poems as he's gone along not precious enough. There's sort of too much with not enough sparkle, and with Muldoon, it's sort of all sparkle and no life anymore. Not to construct a terribly coherent metaphor, but when Muldoon was hosting the podcast, the premise of the podcast is that they bring on a poet every week, and that poet chooses a poem that's already appeared in the New Yorker, and he reads it and then discusses it, and then reads a poem of his own. So in the February 17, 2016 edition, Muldoon interviewed Stephen Dunn, and Stephen Dunn chose a poem by Donald Justice, who was a teacher of his. He chose one of my very favorite poems of all time. And in this podcast, it's short, it's maybe 20 minutes. I'm gonna try to post a link if I can. I'm not sure how that'll work, but I'll post some kind of breadcrumb for you to follow, because it's worth listening to. It's a short interview. Dunn is wonderfully curmudgeonly, and Muldoon, who is a brilliant man, an infuriatingly brilliant man, comes off as a little bit of a eager to please bumbler, to be honest, in this one. I felt a little embarrassed for him. He just seemed very ready to agree with Dunn in a way that it just made me wish that he'd just been quiet. So Dunn reads this poem by Donald Justice. It's the last poem in Justice's collected. It's called "There is a Gold Light in Certain Old Paintings." Just fucking gorgeous poem. And then he discusses it, and he admires it tremendously, but he takes a moment to poke at what he thinks is maybe a loose tile, a little slightly failed choice. And he sort of wiggles it like a loose tooth, and he considers it, and he imagines trying to write it, trying to choose it, and again, Muldoon's thoughts on this are really just, it seems as if he's trying to anticipate Dunn's next criticism. But Dunn, I think, is very sober and fair and measured in his criticism. And, honestly, I know the poem quite well. I knew it quite well the first time I heard this interview, and I don't agree with Dunn. He argues that it's a moment of slight awkwardness, and I think he may be right there, but if anything, that slight awkwardness enhances the effect of the moment in the poem. I think whether it's deliberate or not is a sort of not an interesting question to me, but I think it's highly effective in that moment. I don't actually think that the flaw he points out in the poem is a flaw, but I was really grateful for the attention he gave it for two reasons. I think, for one, it makes the praise of the poem more convincing. I wrote an essay a few years ago about a good friend who's also a poet, and I made a point to include a little bit of grime and grit, a little bit of not entirely picturesque real life, partly because I wanted to show that the admiration was genuine, that it's not all just rainbows and unicorns. And then I also think that when Dunn, examines this funny little word choice that he thinks is maybe a little bit wrong, a little bit weak, it reminded me of I spent a few months working in a costume shop. My getting the second of the two equally useless degrees in drama that I have. But when the head seamstress saw a piece that she really admired, the first thing she would do was flip it over and examine the seamy side as a craftswoman, and that's what it felt like Dunn was doing. He was sort of putting his fingers over the joints, over the knots, over the construction of the piece in order to feel through it and read it the way a poet does, who can admire the craftsmanship, who knows how difficult it is. So that criticism, my experience of it was not that it diminished the poem, not that it lowered the poem's grade or downrated it in some way, but that it actually made it easier to experience the poem more fully. And that may not be, and I gather has not been, the effect of my own critical comments about the poems I've read, but that is the intention. I quickly, just because I can't fucking resist it, it's so good, I'm going to quickly read this poem because it's so good. This is Donald Justice. There is a gold light in certain old paintings. It's a 3-part poem. It's short. There are 3 little sestets. There is a gold light in certain old paintings that represents a diffusion of sunlight. It is like happiness when we are happy. It comes from everywhere and from nowhere at once, this light. And the poor soldiers sprawled at the foot of the cross share in its charity equally with the cross. Orpheus hesitated beside the Black River. With so much to look forward to, he looked back. We think he sang then, but the song is lost. At least he had seen once more the beloved back. I say the song went this way. Oh, prolong now the sorrow, if that is all there is to prolong. The world is very dusty, uncle. Let us work. One day the sickness shall pass from the earth for good. The orchard will bloom. Someone will play the guitar. Our work will be seen as strong and clean and good. And all that we suffered through having existed shall be forgotten, as though it had never existed. So the line, the word that Donne criticized in the poem is the second instance of the word back. With so much to look forward to, he looked back. We think he sang then, but the song is lost. At least he had seen once more the beloved back. That, the back the second time around is a noun, is a body part. And he thought it was a little jarring, a little awkward. Muldoon agreed. One suspects simply because that was the thing Donne had just said. God, it's a fucking weird effect in that, because Muldoon's so smart and he sounds so fucking dumb. But I think if that moment is a little bit jarring, once more he'd seen, at least he'd seen once more the beloved back, rather than the beloved face, of course, which is what one expects. That I think that moment of surprise, that odd disappointment, that clumsiness, is exactly mimetic of Orpheus's experience. Of course, when he turns around, what he expects to see is the face. But he sees her back instead, because she is already returning to Hades. By the way, I don't know this for sure, and I imagine one of the many much more capable scholars who who might hear this could probably correct me, but I have a strong suspicion that the uncle in that last section, the world is very dusty, uncle, let us work. I have a strong suspicion that that uncle is in fact Uncle Vanya, because the last section, that third section, is a loose paraphrase of Sonia's final speech in Uncle Vanya, in which she and Vanya are working. They're very tired, but they have to keep working. They have to maintain the estate on their own. Everybody else is leaving, and they're left alone to keep working. That's their lot in life, is just to work and to love people who don't love them. And she encourages him to work, cheerfully, and to imagine someday in the future, when they go to heaven, everything they've done will be recognized and will be their lives will be seen as valuable, and they will be revealed that God was watching them all along and smiling upon them, and then the just heartbreaking refrain is, we will rest, we will rest, we will rest. And that's the end of the play. And it's maybe worth remembering in that wrenching moment that's the great hope at the end of the play. This very sad domestic play. It's worth remembering Chekhov was an atheist. So Sonia's vision of heaven is absolutely sincere and is really moving. It's not at all mocking. But one does get the feeling that it is a doomed hope, an empty hope. But the whole speech is addressed to her uncle, who is Uncle Vanya. She is the person to whom he is uncle. One of my favorite fucking plays. By the way, Louis Malle, who I mentioned in the 4th episode because he made the ambiguously pornographic movie The Lovers, his very last movie was called Vanya on 42nd Street, and it's terrific. It's a great production of Vanya. It's a great movie. I can't recommend it enough. And not at all pornographic. There's no porn-like elements in that one. Vanya on 42nd Street. All of which is to say, my hope is that when I offer criticism, if anything, I'm sort of polishing the poem rather than tearing it down. But I'll think that over some more. I'll keep chewing on that observation. And then finally, a lot of listeners, most recently Austin, another wonderful poet. A lot of listeners asked what the fuck SLEERICKETS means, which is a reasonable question, I guess, 6 episodes in. So SLEERICKETS is a made-up word. It was made up by my younger daughter. It was her corruption of the word secrets. She couldn't say secret, so she said SLEERICKETS instead. But she also misused it to mean any whispered speech. So when any of us whispered, she would refer to that event as SLEERICKETS. And apart from its incomparable Googleability, given that nobody else uses that fucking word, I liked it because I'm at the moment I'm recording these, I have to record them in the middle of the night. Because the girls are asleep down the hall, so I have to keep my voice down at least when I remember to. Let's finish this very long segment there, and maybe I'm going to read one more fucking poem because why not? And anonymous listener number 2 who said I was long-winded. Sorry for being long-winded. However, you're welcome for all the extra poems this go around. So let's take a break on that note. Okay, we're back. It has been a little longer for me than it has been for you. I've recorded a few of these now, closing segments with poems. And I just haven't been happy with any of them. So it's quite late, and I'm quite tired. And I thought I would just read you a poem that I really love. That's sort of a small, quiet thing, but I've been very fond of it for some time. So much so that I realized only tonight that I stole a version of its opening line in a poem I wrote years ago. But this poem steals its title from another poem, and that poem was from a collection that steals its title from yet another poem, going back and back, so I don't feel too guilty. I'm going to read a poem by Ashley Anna McHugh tonight. This is "The unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding." And it is somewhat significant. That title is taken from Anthony Hecht's wonderful poem, A Letter, which I might read to you on another night because it's also one of my very favorites. That poem is an epistolary poem spoken to a former lover, a former adulterous lover. And in that poem, he uses a sort of a governing metaphor of the blood as a deep and constantly moving sea, in which the lover is never forgotten and the past is never forgotten. And he says, "The blundering blood knows what it knows. It talks to itself all night like a sliding moonlit sea." And then toward the end of the poem, he says of this same sea, "My dearest, the clear, unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding." So that's where Ashley Anna McHugh got the title of this poem, which originally appeared in the Hopkins Review and was later published in Into These Knots, a collection that won the New Criterion Prize, I think, in 2010. So this is a little sonnet. "The unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding. For John Fogelman" is the dedication. There are some things we just don't talk about. Not even in the morning, when we're waking. When your calloused fingers tentatively walk the slope of my waist. How love's a rust-worn boat, abandoned at the dock. And who could doubt waves lick their teeth, eyeing its hull? We're taking our wreckage as a promise, so we don't talk. We wet the tired oars, tide drawing us out. We understand there's nothing to be said. Both of us know the dangers of this sea. Warned by the tide-worn driftwood of our pasts. But we've already strayed from the harbor. We thread a slow wake through the water. Then silently, we start to row, and will for as long as this lasts. So in Hecht's poem, the speaker addresses his former lover with a new perspective on everything that they shared, and an understanding that it's best for them not really to think of each other, certainly not to talk to each other, and really it's fairer to everyone if they just forget all about it. And in McHugh's poem, there's a similar understanding, but it's in the moment. It's a sad poem, but it's a slightly different sadness, because rather than looking back on a doomed affair, her lovers are looking forward. They're looking into their own immediate present and future. And so the whole poem takes place in that sliding moonlit sea. They're in the sea the whole time, which for Hecht was a sort of a symbol of the restless past. For them, in McHugh's poem, it's all around them. It would be very easy for this metaphor of the sea to get tiresome and silly and sort of goofy, sentimental. But I think what helps is that it is itself a kind of a pretense, a conceit, that they know that what they're doing is foolish. They already know. The poem already seems to make a mockery of the metaphor that consumes their relationship. Down to the waves licking their teeth, eyeing the hull. It's a sort of a cartoon. That's the substance of their days together. There is, I think, a slight development between the first line of the octave, I should say, and the first line of the sestet. The poem begins, "There are some things we just don't talk about." And then the sestet begins, "We understand there's nothing to be said." In both cases, there's no talking, but in the first case, there's a suggestion that there might be some denial. And in the second, there's no room left for denial. It's not that they're resisting the talk, it's that there's a resignation. There's an understanding that this can go nowhere. But it doesn't end with a shipwreck or something like this. It ends with the steady, quiet, deliberate continuation. We start to row and will for as long as this lasts. It is a potentially very sentimental image, but the tone of the whole poem is so muted, so restrained. I find it quite moving. But as I said, I'm very tired, so I'm just going to read it again and then sign off. "This is the unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding," by Ashley Anna McHugh. There are some things we just don't talk about. Not even in the morning, when we're waking. When your calloused fingers tentatively walk the slope of my waist. How love's a rust-worn boat, abandoned at the dock. And who could doubt waves lick their teeth, eyeing its hull? We are taking our wreckage as a promise, so we don't talk. We wet the tired oars, tide drawing us out. We understand there's nothing to be said. Both of us know the dangers of this sea, warned by the tide-worn driftwood of our pasts, but we've already strayed from the harbor. We thread a slow wake through the water. Then silently we start to row, and will for as long as this lasts. I don't quite know what to make of that little choice. We thread, line break, a slow wake through the water. Fulfills the form. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that choice, but I do really love on another reading the line, "We wet the tired oars, tide drawing us out," which is a wonderfully passive way of saying that we row the boat. We wet the oars. There's a deep acknowledgement there that they are not the ones in control. There are other forces moving them at this point. Well, that was Ashley Anna McHugh's poem, "The unquarried blue of those depths is all but blinding." And this is SLEERICKETS. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you to everybody who wrote in with questions, comments, complaints, suggestions. Please continue. I imagine I will whether it's all in one episode or piecemeal, I will do my best to respond to everyone who has something to say. So do write in if you have a chance. Subscribe and rate and review the podcast. But even if you don't do any of that, take a moment if you like what you've heard and just recommend the show to a friend. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again pretty soon. Till then.